I was told this very scary story which took place 20 years ago by a nurse who also happened to be one of my colleagues. Back when she was young, she volunteered for the local medical team and had encounters with many spooky things. Since I didn't have much work to do on that day, I told her to recount the story. Back in the days, besides doctors, there were also Taoists who claimed that they could cure people. One of the female nurses said that it was just superstition as it sounded too good to be true for a Taoist to cure someone. I then told her that there were mysterious things happening long ago yet hadn't been scientifically explained yet. We started listening to the woman's story. That year, her medical team was sent to a mountainous area for conducting a survey as a medical center was soon to be opened there. The village head was a man named Shin. He told the team to stay at the infirmary as he would assist them if they needed any help. The team leader asked Mr. Shin where he kept the herbs, then assigned the tasks to his teammates. Suddenly, there were noises of people arguing outside. Everyone curiously went out to check. Turned out that the wife of the village chief was having a quarrel with another woman who desperately appealed for her husband to be freed. Seeing the doctors, the woman instantly rushed to them. She went to the leader of the group, knelt down and cried terribly. The woman then begged them to save her husband from death. The village chief and his wife quickly rushed to stop the woman, saying she was being emotionally unstable. But the doctor requested the two to let go of her as she wanted to check on her husband's condition. Mr. Shin couldn't hide the anger on his face. He told the doctor that the man had been possessed and was under treatment, thus he shouldn't interfere in the process. Now the doctor was even more concerned as he heard the village had said something about possession. He insisted on seeing the sick man. As they were on their way to the place where the man was being treated, the woman introduced herself as Lan, while Zon was her husband, then recounted the story to the doctors. Her husband Zon and the village chief were close friends as the term of office was about to expire. Shin had to cede the position for village chief to Zon. However, the head's wife was displeased as she didn't like her and Zon at all. That day, after Zon returned home from the jungle, the woman saw a red wound on her husband's forehead, yet Zon reassured her that it was just him clumsily tripping. However, Zon suddenly had a change in his personality as he constantly chased and hit other people without any reason. It was rumored that Zon had been possessed by a ghost, hence not being capable of becoming the next village chief. What was even scarier, the man acted more outrageously as he grabbed his head and screamed loudly, saying there were hundreds of insects wriggling in his head. Having no other choice, Lan had to tie her husband to his bed, leaving him shouting in pain. But one day the man untied the rope and rushed outside, which was completely unexpected to Lan. He aggressively attacked everyone he encountered. Later, the villagers had to tie him up and carry him to the house of the village chief. One Taoist said that Zon had been possessed, thus he needed to have the ghost removed at once. Zon was locked in a warehouse afterwards, looking miserable. Later, the man was being soaked in a big jar whilst having his body being tied firmly. Every day Lan went to take care of her husband, but the strange illness just tormented Zon as it had no sign of remission. Even on days when it was freezing cold and snow was falling outside, Zon was still trapped in the jar. Fearing that her husband would die if he continued to deal with this extreme situation, Lan begged the Taoist to release him, but the man immediately rejected it. Being furious, Lan rushed to her husband intending to set him free, yet instantly got stopped by the villagers. The village chief's wife closed the door tightly, sarcastically told Lan that her husband was unworthy of governing the village, then kicked her out. Lan was heartbroken to recount the story. She neither believed her husband was possessed nor could be cured by that Taoist. As they finally arrived at the place, the scene appeared before their eyes freaked them out the moment they opened the door. Zon looked extremely fatigued. He was trembling from the freezing cold while his body was tied firmly. The water surface had also frozen. How could it be tolerable for a human being to endure all of this? The doctors quickly carried him out to the jar. Everyone was stunned. They wondered how the man was being treated in such a wrongfully strange way. The Taoist was also there. He looked worried, as if he was in fear of something. Meanwhile, the village's head's wife was saying something under her breath as she disdainfully gazed at the doctors. Zon was rushed to the hospital afterwards. His whole body was covered with sores. However, the man didn't make it as the sores became larger. He foamed at the mouth and died tragically. But the moment before he died, the man had held the chief's name and pointed his finger at him. Alan felt an immense pain in her heart as she witnessed the death of her husband. The female nurse had a suspicion that this incident had something to do with the village head and his wife. Lan returned home with great sadness while the villagers were still gossiping. They said Zon had done many bad things before, hence not being saved. Later that afternoon, the group of doctors had a discussion as the main doctor believed that the man had been killed by an abnormal parasite. The rest of the group was assigned to go out and inform the villagers that the man had died from a parasitic disease, not demonic possession. After telling the villagers to be cautious about the virus, the female nurse gazed at Lan's house. As she headed to the house, she saw two children running past her while yelling loudly. The female nurse kept walking. As she gazed inside, she saw Lan was comforting her son. Lan told her that her son was teased by some other kids. Thus, she chased them away. A while later at the riverbank, the two kids that the female nurse had previously encountered were found dead, drowning. What was more horrifying, there were sores appearing on the two corpses, which similarly happened to Zon. The villagers believed it was the ghost of Zon that sought revenge on them. One of the two children who died at the scene was that of the village chief. Hearing people say Lan had chased the two kids moments earlier, the wife became furious as she claimed it was Lan's fault that caused the death of her child. The wife aggressively rushed to Lan's house. She slammed the door, intending to hurt her. Unfortunately, as she kicked on the door, the roof tiles dropped from above and landed on her head. She screamed painfully as blood slowly dripped down. Lan and the female nurse were stunned to witness the scene. The nurse quickly checked on her, but it seemed like the severe injuries had made her lose consciousness. After the woman was taken to the infirmary, she suddenly acted crazy as soon as she awoke. The woman was tied to the bed right away. What terrified those present at the scene was the woman started having sores all over her body. The woman quickly got frightened as she didn't expect herself to endure this horrific disease. The female nurse quickly informed the village head on his wife's condition. The main doctor expressed his disappointment as he told Shin that his wife had been infected with the parasite that had killed Zon. Since the symptoms developed too quickly, there was just a slim chance for her to make it out alive. Shin refused to believe the doctor as he called some of the villagers to help him bring his wife to the Taoist, asking him to remove the ghost from her. The villagers quickly gathered in front of the Taoist's house. They seemingly didn't believe the doctors either. The main doctor told the nurse that he still hadn't figured out how the parasitic virus was transmitted, as some got infected by it while others didn't. All of a sudden, from inside the house, there were piercing screams which aroused the amazement of those who gathered outside. Shortly after that, they frantically ran away, which created absolute chaos. The female nurse rushed inside the house to check. The scary scene in front of her eyes instantly made her skin crawl. The village head's wife had died as she laid in a pool of blood with foam in her mouth and sores spreading on her body just like Zon. However, it was another thing that caused her death. Laying next to the woman was the Taoist. Turned out that Mr. Shin had beaten his wife to death with a bar as he claimed the two had gone crazy and Zon was there to take revenge on them. Later that evening, Mr. Shin had ended up being killed the same way as he foamed at the mouth while having sores and parasitic worms all over his body. Lun was in utter confusion as she couldn't figure out why she and her child weren't infected. According to the doctor, it was the wounds and injuries that allowed this parasitic virus to be transmitted. They only survived for a short period of time in natural environments, but could extend their lifespan if they stuck to open wounds. After the incident, a team of researchers on parasitic viruses was sent to the village. They quickly disinfected the whole area, and no one had contracted the strange disease ever since. After the female nurse finished her story, she still had no idea if there was actually a deadly virus in the village, or was it just the ghost of Zon that caused the horrific incident. This story revolves around the terrifying incidents that took place at a poor village which was located somewhere in the mountainous area of China. The protagonist of the story is a guy named Fong. He was a good-looking young man with gentle, likable character and was always hard-working. His daily job was to go mushroom picking in the mountains and then traded the mushrooms at the market. One day, as usual, Fong went to the forest on his own. The continuous rainfall that took place recently had allowed lots of mushrooms to grow. Fong picked the mushrooms carefully, checked them one by one, and then put them in the bamboo basket on his back. Then he made his way deep into the forest. As he was walking, he suddenly smelled a heavy scent. It gently drifted through the forest breeze. Fong was quickly dazzled by the lovely scent. He looked around and decided to follow his nose. The fresh scent led him to go further into the forest. Fong was amazed to find out that the source of this beautiful scent was actually from a wild flower. But this one was different, as it was the first time in his life seeing such a strange-looking flower. It looked similar to a lotus bud, with small petals that unfolded in circles, surrounding the white bud. The flower looked pretty similar to the jasmine since it had thin petals. The pistils in the middle still had nectar on them. The heavy scent released from the flower and the aura surrounding it immediately caught the man's attention. But what amazed him the most was there was only one special flower like this one growing up in the middle of this deserted forest. Out of curiosity, Fong approached the flower. The flower suddenly gave off strong unpleasant smell that made him cover his nose and step backwards. Later he found out there were large and long roots tightly tying the small flower, as if they were absorbing all the nutrients of the small plant. As he walked along the roots, he saw a bush nearby. He approached it and found out there was something mysterious hiding behind the grooves. Curiously, he grabbed the roots and pulled them out strongly, but there was something heavy affecting them and hence prevented him from doing it. Then the man came up with an idea. He followed the roots to see where they would lead him to. The amazement within him piled up as he realized the thing in front of him was not something in the underground. Actually, it was a pumpkin that had already been withered. From the top of the vegetable appeared a long root. It was also the one that made him curious the whole time. Fong couldn't hide the disappointment mixed with a bit of surprise on his face. He kept staring at the pumpkin. and wondered to himself how there could be a pumpkin that grew in such a strange way, and how bizarre it seemed to him. Fong walked close to the pumpkin. He realized it had the same size of a watermelon, but there were some dark spots on it that looked like they had been rotten. He carefully checked the pumpkin, then decided to take it home and sell it at the market later, as he assumed he could sell the vegetable at a good price. Or maybe he should show it to the villagers and to find out what type of pumpkin this one was. It wasn't an everyday thing to encounter with a pumpkin like this, hence the man was curious to see what it looked like inside. He put the pumpkin in his basket and then went down the mountain. On his way he was thinking that he would do this to the pumpkin he just found. He kept thinking about it up until he left the dense forest and returned to his village. Fong headed to the market. When he showed the pumpkin to the villagers, they quickly gathered round it to take a look of it. They asked where he had found it.
Wow.
Some was amazed to learn there was a pumpkin this big growing in the forest. They looked at it in amazement. A young man among the crowd suggested to Fong to put it up for auction, but another one told Fong to be careful with the pumpkin. The forest was considered a sacred place, and there was no chance for a pumpkin like this to grow in it. One villager suggested cutting the pumpkin in half to see what was inside it. Fong agreed with the idea. He held a knife in his hands and was about to cut it in the presence of the villagers. Suddenly a male voice came out from behind, saying, "Stop it! Do not cut the pumpkin!" The villagers turned around. It was an old man standing at the end of the queue. Fong was surprised to the man's remark. He asked, "Why not cut the pumpkin?" The old man spoke in a sacred manner. "This spooky pumpkin has been cursed." The villagers talked to each other in a tumult of confusion. What if the old man was speaking the truth? Then Fong had brought bad luck to the villagers. Fong was extremely annoyed by what the old man had told him. He snapped at the man, saying what he just said was nonsense. The old man remained calm to Fong's anger. He looked at him and said that the pumpkin was not that normal and harmless as it might seem. Everybody was amazed to hear it. They asked how they could know the pumpkin was not normal. The old man recollected everything. He told the villagers a story that had happened to him years ago. In the old days, when the war broke out, the Japanese fascists had brutally killed off people in the forest. They tied up people who opposed them with a long rope and made them line up horizontally in front of the gun barrels. Then the commander would order the soldiers to shoot at them. After the noises of gunshots, blood was seen spilling everywhere. The scene was horrific and terrifying. The souls of those who tragically died at the forest were still there. They turned into blue balls of flame, wandering around the forest, therefore making the atmosphere at the place always gloomy and cold. The souls were sent to a wildflower since they were absorbed into it. The flower was very different from others. It was spooky and ghostly. As time passed by, from the spot of the wildflower grew a pumpkin, and it was the one that Fong brought home today. Actually, there were elsewhere in the forest that had white flowers like it. The villagers were scared as they listened to the old man. Some told Fong not to cut the pumpkin as they believed what he said was true. But the young men in the village didn't think that way. They assumed it was just a made-up story of the old man to scare villagers. The contradictory ideas from two sides quickly caused fierce quarrels to break out. The atmosphere started becoming tense and noisy, which made Fong extremely annoyed. At that moment, the group of young teenagers was behind Fong. They challenged him to cut the pumpkin open. The old man tried to talk him out of doing it. Then he turned around and walked away, yet not forgetting to say something before leaving. "One day you will regret for what you have done today." The old man's words kept echoing on his mind. He stayed silent and felt bewildered. However, out of curiosity, he decided to cut the pumpkin open. As he reached to a sharp knife, he looked at the pumpkin placed on the wooden cutting board. Without hesitation, the man cut the pumpkin with a great force. It immediately split in half, and a terrifying scene happened before the villagers' eyes. Blood inside the pumpkin splashed everywhere following the cut. The villagers were scared to death to see the scene. There was nothing but blood inside the pumpkin. Blood was spilling everywhere on Fong's body. Some couldn't even stand the fishy smell and had to cover their noses. The villagers blamed everything on Fong. They accused him of bringing ghosts to the village and he had to be held responsible for it. The villagers left after the incident. They left him standing there in bewilderment. That morning, the villagers had been scared out of their wits. They locked the doors as soon as they got home, not daring to go out due to the fear for encountering ghosts. And the horror had happened. That night, Fong couldn't sleep as he felt a burning pain all over his body. Despite not being scratched by anyone, pieces of his skin was peeled off and fell onto the floor. The smell of blood was all over his body. Fong felt itchy and extremely painful. It felt like there was some kind of invisible force slowly torn apart his layers of skin. In just a blink of an eye, the skin on the lower half of his face had been removed. Under the dim light, Fong got off his bed and took heavy steps. Fong was so scared and ashamed of his look. He covered up his face and went to the old man's house asking for his help. He assumed the old man must know something about the white flower and the pumpkin, and know how to cure this obscure disease. If the villagers found out about Fong having this rare disease, they would definitely force him to leave the village, and this worried him a lot. Fong plucked up his courage. He knocked on the door. A while later, someone finally came out to open the door. The old man gazed at Fong and asked, "What's happened?" Fong looked at the old man with his soulful eyes, then slowly pulled down the cover on his face, revealing the open sores. He then said it was the pumpkin that caused him to be like that. Seeing the ulcers on his face, the old man couldn't help but be shocked. He stood open-mouthed as he found out it was a pumpkin that caused this. The old man then told Fong to come inside his house. Fong was extremely frightened. He pleaded the old man for help. The old man gazed at Fong in disappointment as he had tried to warn him before, yet he didn't listen to him. He told Fong, "Crush the pumpkin into powder, then apply it onto the ulcers. They will heal in 2 hours." Fong was so happy to know that he could be saved at last, but he soon realized that he had thrown the pumpkin into the river this afternoon. The old man grabbed his flashlight, then told Fong to follow him to the forest for the antidote. He knew where to find a pumpkin that was similar to the one Fong had found. The two set out to the forest at midnight. Fong asked the old man, "How could you know so much about that pumpkin?" The man told him a story related to the curse of the pumpkin that had happened to him before. When he was young, Jan, his younger brother, had dealt with the same situation. The younger brother was just like Fong. He accidentally found a pumpkin in the forest, and then happily brought it home and showed it to the villagers. They gathered around him, amazed at the bizarre pumpkin. Jan happily brought it home as a gift for his wife. That night, he and his wife had small discussion over what to do with the pumpkin. The married couple and their son gathered around the pumpkin. They decided to bring it to the market and sell it for some money. Suddenly, there were knocks outside. The whole family was amazed that it was already late. They didn't expect to have a guest coming that late. A middle-aged man, formally dressed with a briefcase in his hands, came inside. The man introduced his name in a hoarse voice, but there was something unfriendly of him that made the whole family feel wary. The man said he came from the south and offered to buy the pumpkin. Seeing Jan being hesitant about his offer, the man continued by saying that the pumpkin was actually a spiritual one and he was willing to buy it at any price. Jan was thinking for a while. He wondered how the man knew about the pumpkin. The man said it could cure some incurable diseases and was extremely rare. The villagers had told him about the pumpkin and told him to go to Jan's house. Jan asked the man how much money he could pay for the pumpkin. The man raised his 5 fingers and offered to buy the plant at a high price, one that was beyond Jan's imagination. 500,000 won. Jan was shocked. It was a tremendous amount of money to him. The man convinced Jan to sell the pumpkin to him. He said the pumpkin could have a low value to Jan, but to him it was completely the opposite. A scenario of enormous wealth appeared right before the young man's eyes. The man continued by saying that he would help Jan become the richest man in the village if he agreed to sell the pumpkin to him. But Jan had to take him to the forest and show where the pumpkins like this one were. Of course, Jan would earn a high commission for taking the man to the place. Jan didn't hesitate to take the offer. Things happened so smooth that he didn't know what to do except gladly accepting it. But the man wanted to go to the forest right at that moment, which amazed the whole family, as it wasn't a good idea to go to the forest in the middle of the night. Jan refused to take him to the forest as he felt uneasy about leaving his wife and son at home this late. So he suggested to wait until the sun came up and then they would set off. But the man said he couldn't wait. He even offered to raise the price for the pumpkin if Jan agreed to take him to the forest immediately. Now Jan couldn't miss this once-of-a-lifetime opportunity. He agreed with the man's offer and said goodbye to his wife and son. Before leaving for the forest, he reminded them to lock the door and told them that he would be back soon. Then Jan and the man set off their journey. With a worrying expression on her face, the wife told Jan to be careful, as it could be dangerous to go to the forest this late. Jan reassured his wife, saying that he would be back home soon. The woman held her child in her arms and gazed at her husband with anxious eyes. She looked insecure as she sensed something mysterious about the man. The two watched Jan and the strange man walking their way to the forest, until their figure faded into darkness. That night, as the woman had lulled the child to sleep, she was still thinking about her husband. The sun had come up, but Jan hadn't returned. Sensing something bad had happened, she told the villagers about the incident and asked them to help her find Jan. The villagers agreed to go to the forest to look for Jan and the mysterious man, as they also believed there was something dangerous and untrustworthy about the man. So they went to the forest. As they had arrived, they split into smaller groups and went to different directions searching for Jan. The villagers called out his name. Their voices resounded throughout the forest, but there was no answer from him. It was until noon, when everyone had been tired. A group of young men had witnessed a shockingly terrifying scene. Everyone was freaked out to see the scene before their eyes, as it was so brutal and dreadful. As Jan's wife rushed to the scene, she couldn't hold back her tears, bursted out crying loudly. The mysterious man had killed Jan. His body leaned against a tree, mouth opened in fear while the eyes were wide open. The wife rushed to her dead husband, hugged him while crying out in extreme pain. A gloomy atmosphere pervaded the whole forest. The villagers were determined to find the mysterious man to take revenge on him. There was a high chance that he was still in the forest. The villagers separated in smaller groups searching for the man. The intense and furious look was visible on their faces. One villager found a clue about the man. He kept searching. As the man walked for a bit longer, he screamed out loud and fell to the ground as if he had witnessed something truly scary. The other villagers rushed to see what happened. The young man pointed to the place where he had just seen the horrors. Everybody was shocked to see the scene before their eyes. The mysterious man had died. He laid next to the tree roots, mouth wide open just like Jan. However, he was still tightly holding the pumpkin that Jan had showed to the villagers. The expression on his face was bizarre yet horrifying. By the look of his face, one could easily tell the man had witnessed something truly scary, while he was keeping the pumpkin with him. Everyone was freaked out. In just a morning, the villagers had found 2 dead bodies in the forest. There was a strong likelihood that the man was killed by the ghosts in the forest. The villagers believed it was a fitting punishment for the man, as he had previously killed Jan in such a brutal manner. As the old man finishing telling his story, Fong asked him, "So what happens after that? Who was the mysterious man?" The old man calmly replied, "He was a grave robber from the south who specialized in trading spooky things." Fong expressed his amazement. "How did you know so well about the pumpkin?" The old man then confessed that he was told about its magical uses by his master, but he never truly believed it. These spooky pumpkins could absorb the souls of dead people. Although they could cure many incurable diseases, they were extremely dangerous. The two then reached the end of the forest. At this moment, Fong realized that they had arrived at the spot where he found out about the pumpkin and the white flower. Both Fong and the old man saw the long roots laying on the ground. The old man reached to his pocket and pulled out a knife. He made a cut to one of the roots. From the cut, a white sap oozed out. The old man told Fong to apply the white sap on his face and the ulcers. The old man gazed at the tree roots. He looked worriedly. He believed if the tree roots were still developing, there would be other pumpkins growing in the forest. Then the man suddenly recalled having a book from his master that illustrated a way of removing these tree roots. He didn't expect that one day he would have to use it. The next morning, Fong went to the old man's house. The two carried bamboo baskets that were loaded with yellow powder, which was made by the old man himself. Then they set out to the forest again. As they arrived at the spot, the old man sprinkled the powder on the tree roots. Oddly, as the powder was sprinkled on them, the roots quickly shrunk and became withered. Fong also followed him to do the same. The tree roots altogether withered and died. The old man then took out an incense burner, then lit 3 incense sticks. He made an altar to honor the souls wandering in his forest, and also free them. The atmosphere in the forest suddenly became warmer and fresher. The two went down the mountain after finishing their work. In the forest, the tree roots once again were reborn. They wrapped around the big trunks and sprouted a white flower. Dr. Chan was well known in the area for his healing skills and knowledge of all diseases. One day, he received a very serious invitation from a farmer's house in the village. Following the tour guide, he walked for more than 20 minutes to reach the place. According to the guide, his father seemed to be in a critical condition. "Hurry up, doctor. My father can't take it anymore." Arriving in front of the house, the man opened the old gate and invited Dr. Chan inside. As he led the doctor inside, he hurriedly called out to his mother. "Mother, I invited Dr. Chan to come here." The mother had just come out, repeatedly urging him in because she was afraid that her husband's condition would not make him last long. The mother invited Dr. Chan inside while talking about her husband's situation. Her husband just got sick 2 days ago and was getting worse very quickly. The person lying on the bed was an older man with a pale face and wide open mouth and eyes rolled backwards. Dr. Chan approached to examine the man's situation. The older man rolled his eyes, panicking and continuously shouting, "It hurts so much. They are crawling all over me. Please kill me. I'm in so much pain." A blanket covered the older man, so Dr. Chan didn't know what the man's problem was. So Dr. Chan decided to come and see what was under the blanket. But when he approached, the man strongly reacted to Dr. Chan. He pushed Dr. Chan away. It seemed that the disease had made the man panic and no longer aware of his surroundings. But with his years of experience, Dr. Chan quickly convinced the man to be examined. Despite following the doctor's orders, the older man still seemed to be very uncomfortable and afraid. As soon as he lifted the blanket, Dr. Chan was amazed to see the patient's current condition. The older man's belly was monstrously bulged. Suddenly, the older man appeared to be in pain, as if just moving could make his whole body suffer. Dr. Chan now seemed to understand the older man's condition, so he told the older man's son and wife to hold him tightly. Both of them joined forces to be able to hold the older man down, even though he was struggling with pain. After the older man was held tightly, Dr. Chan unbuttoned the older man's shirt, revealing a tight, swollen abdomen full of veins and blood. Dr. Chan now looked thoughtfully at the large and protruding belly of what looked like tendons. They were all very large and swollen on the skin of the older man's abdomen. But strangely, these tendons could move, or rather, it looked like worms or parasites inside of him. Dr. Chan seemed to have understood the problem. He turned to take out the acupuncture needles from the toolbox. The needles were long and sharp, but Dr. Chan believed that they could definitely help the older man now. Dr. Chan just stopped thinking for a moment, then started his treatment. Acupuncture needles were inserted into the older man's belly in sequence. Dr. Chan was very good at this acupuncture method. After a while, acupuncture needles were quickly inserted all over the man's belly, and the things that looked like worms also started to stop moving. And a few minutes later, they disappeared completely, no longer visible on the skin of the older man's belly. The older man now also began to calm down, feeling less pain, and was able to rest for a while. The son seemed very worried about his father. He hurriedly asked Dr. Chan what strange illness his father was suffering from. Dr. Chan did not talk directly about the disease at this time, but he began to learn more about the time the older man got sick. Dr. Chan said to the son, "Your father had been infected with a type of poisonous parasite. If left for any longer, it would consume all of his organs. The situation is very dire." The son asked Dr. Chan if his father would be saved. The wife also said that her husband suddenly became strange a few days ago after cutting grass to feed the cows. That's when he began to feel sick. Upon hearing that, Dr. Chan quickly asked her about the location of the lawn, as he wanted the patient's family to lead him there to check it out and inspect. According to his mother's description, the son also knew the location of the lawn area. By the time it was getting dark, the son had already started taking Dr. Chan because it was around wild grass growing relatively far from their home. On the way, the son still didn't understand why his father's illness had something to do with the wild grass. But Dr. Chan still didn't explain anything. He had his own conclusions. After walking quite a distance, the son said they were almost there. They just have to go behind the cliff and they would arrive. When he arrived, Dr. Chan was amazed and also afraid. It seemed that his suspicions were correct. In front of them was a bunch of weeds, as tall as people and at first glance, as normal as any other type of weed. Dr. Chan and the son started to walk closer to the grassy area. The doctor was extremely wary, but the son didn't know what was going on. Dr. Chan walked and looked around like he was looking for something. Finally, he found what he was looking for. Seeing that they had been gone for quite a long time from home, and with the doctor being extremely quiet without telling him about his father's condition, the son began to worry. At this point, Dr. Chan began to explain to the son the cause of the appearance of the parasites. A parasite caused his father's illness. They were infecting and sucking blood from his father's belly fat. The parasite was born from a strange worm, and it only reproduced on this type of weed. After that, Dr. Chan started rummaging through his tool bag. The son still didn't understand what Dr. Chan was going to do. Then Dr. Chan gave the son a thick scarf that looked like it was sewn with many layers. The two began to approach the weeds, and Dr. Chan needed to experiment a bit to be sure to find something that could treat the patient. After a while of searching, Dr. Chan reached out and picked a branch of the tree which grew among the weeds. Indeed, if they looked at it with the naked eye, it would be difficult to distinguish this plant in the middle of a vast lawn. Even the son was very surprised. Dr. Chan held up the branch high and asked the son to look closely above the small leaves, which were the eggs of the parasites. At this point, the son was starting to get scared but still wanted to know what it was, so he also looked at the leaf. And indeed, on the surface of the leaves, there were some seeds, tiny as white as a grain of rice. When he tried to take a closer look, the son suddenly realized that they were eggs and covered with thin membrane-like spider silk. The son wondered, this thing was so small, how could it cause such a terrible disease? Dr. Chan didn't explain much, he just asked the son to take a good look at what he does next. Dr. Chan rummaged through his pocket and pulled out a small vial. Then he gave it to the son, telling him to apply it on his face and hands. Applying this drug would help avoid insects, even those parasitic larvae that attack the body. After that, Dr. Chan started going deep into the grass, like he was looking for something. The weeds around here were taller than a person's head, so there was a lot of potential for danger. In the end, it seemed that Dr. Chan had found something important that could help cure the older man's illness. After reaching out to pick a tree branch, Dr. Chan showed it to the son. There were many small purple fruits on the branch, which looked very strange. Dr. Chan held it out in front of the son and told him to look for more fruits like this. It grew from the same tree on which the poisonous parasites lay their eggs. Dr. Chan told him to look carefully and pick a lot to bring back to save his father. The two began to split up to find and pick the strange fruit which only reproduced on this plant, and only its fruit could kill those parasites. In just a moment, the two were able to pick a lot of fruit. After getting out of the weeds, Dr. Chan suddenly took a small knife and cut a small cut on his finger. The son was extremely surprised but still very quiet, watching Dr. Chan. Next, Dr. Chan began to drip his own blood from the cut. The drop of blood fell directly onto the leaf containing the small larva eggs. At this moment, the son was putting the leaf on the handkerchief and holding it in his hand. What happened next made him extremely scared. After the drop of blood permeated the egg sacs, they seemed to begin to move. From within the tiny eggs, strange creatures looking like small worms began to break the egg sac and came out. At first, they were just bigger than a thread, but after they sucked all the blood on the leaf, they suddenly became as big as chopsticks. They gradually got bigger and bigger. In an instant, they almost filled out the entire handkerchief the son was holding, making him shiver with fear. At that moment, Dr. Chan took the purple fruit he had just picked. He gently squeezed the fruit and it immediately oozed the purple liquid. After that, he directly dripped it onto a parasite. Miraculously, the purple juice from the wild fruit worked. The poisonous parasite began to writhe in pain and then withered and died. Seeing these things, the son also understood what the doctor wanted to say. Suddenly, Dr. Chan seemed to remember something. He glanced at these weeds and thought for a moment. But now, it was getting dark. They needed to go home with this pile of purple fruit quickly. The doctor did not forget to ask the son if anyone had known this lawn area, and Dr. Chan began to worry when he looked closely at the weeds behind him. He was worried that if he continued to leave this lawn and this dangerous plant here, more people would be harmed. So Dr. Chan asked more carefully if this land was owned by anyone or not. Because the older man's condition was critical, they didn't talk much but quickly went home to treat him. Arriving home, Dr. Chan gave the bunch of plants to the wife and told her to get a basin and squeeze all the juice of these purple fruits into it. After squeezing the juice, Dr. Chan began to pull out all the needles that had been inserted into the older man's belly in the first place. Within those purple fruits seemed to be a lot of liquid, so a full basin was squeezed out. Dr. Chan said to the wife, "Take this wet towel and wipe your husband all over his body." This method would cause pain to the parasites and was intended to force the parasites out of the patient. Following Dr. Chan's instructions, the wife quickly wiped it all over her husband, and then they allowed a few minutes so that the purple juice could penetrate the skin. A few minutes later, when the time came, Dr. Chan held a small scalpel. He cut an extended cut on the patient's wrist. This would be the way for the parasites to escape. And yes, after the purple water had penetrated into the skin, the parasites began to ache and increasingly wiggle beneath the older man's skin. They were crawling around and seemed to be looking for a way to get out. The sight was terrifying. Witnessing what happened in front of their eyes, the wife was terrified, wondering if her husband could stand it. Seeing that Dr. Chan tried his best to comfort her, everything would be resolved soon. At this point, the parasites began to appear all over the older man's body. It turned out that they had proliferated a lot in his stomach and were now trying to crawl out. The parasites eventually discovered the cut on the older man's wrist, so they started making their way there. In an instant, they began to crawl out from the wound on the older man's wrist. The scene was gruesome. Long parasites like worms were jostling to escape the older man's body. At a glance, these parasites were fat and red. It seemed that they had sucked a lot of blood from the older man's body. And after only a few minutes, all the parasites came out from the mouth of the wound. Underneath the floor, Dr. Chan also left a basin of purple fruit juice, so they fell straight into it. The purple juice began to work, directly killing those fat parasites. They withered and decomposed utterly, leaving only a pungent stench like the smell of carrion. After the parasites had all escaped, the older man's body started returning to normal. Dr. Chan turned back and informed the son and his mother that his father was out of danger. Dr. Chan advised a few more things to take better care of the older man. After a few days of rest, he would get better. After that, Dr. Chan also said goodbye to the older man's family because he needed to handle something important. Because he already had a plan in mind, Dr. Chan decided to deal with this problem decisively. Otherwise, many more people would be harmed by this poisonous parasite. That night, Dr. Chan walked towards the weed area in the afternoon. He lit a fire and burned it all. He hoped that no one would be accidentally infected with this blood-sucking parasite ever again. To carry out the project of developing an ecotourism area, Shion, the company's president, and Jin, his secretary, went on a field survey trip. They went into a deserted forest, and it seemed that very few people visited this place. The special point of interest was that this place had a lot of mushrooms. Not thinking about whether this mushroom was edible or not, but considering its unique and strange appearance, it was enough to make Shion excited. Thinking it was a rare mushroom, Shion thought of putting it up for sale. He felt like he was digging for gold because they were everywhere. Shion also paid a lot of money to buy this mountain, so if he picked mushrooms to sell, he would be able to earn even more money. Both of them were extremely excited. Shion quickly directed Jin to pick as many mushrooms as possible and not to miss anything. After picking for a while, Jin suddenly saw a village ahead. "Boss, there's a house in front." That was a big discovery. The village seemed completely isolated from the outside world. Shion couldn't help but be surprised. What the hell was there in the project report? This made Shion very angry because that was the area he bought. No one was allowed to build a village over there. They quickly went into the village to check. At the time, someone was hearing their voices and opened the door to see who they were. These people appeared ancient, dressed casually, and especially had very similar appearances. Jin braggily shouted at the people that they built their village illegally while it was sold to Xion. This is when the village head came out, saying that the village had existed there for more than 100 years before, and why they should not live there. Immediately Jin angrily spoke up and asked them if they had lived there for more than 100 years and asked them to prove this was their land. What are real estate documents? The village head heard this and did not know how to explain it. Suddenly, Xion signaled Jin to stop. He asked Jin if he could smell the fragrance. Both of them sniffed and inhaled. The scent smelled really good. It tasted like mushroom rice. While seeing that, the village head introduced that this time of year mushrooms grew the most and fastest. In every village, every house cooked these mushrooms with rice. While he was hungry, Xion asked them to quickly let him taste it. When the villagers heard this, they expressed their displeasure. Xion was invited into the village leader's house. He naturally enjoyed himself at home. He ate and excitedly praised it. After eating, Xion asked the village leader for the rest of the mushrooms in the house so he could bring back some. However, if they gave it all to him, they would have nothing left to eat. Jin saw this, so he asked him to hurry and bring more mushrooms to him. He also threatened him not to offend Xion because this was his land. However, the village leader really struggled because those were all the mushrooms they had left. After listening to this, Xion frowned and showed anger. He immediately grabbed the village leader by the collar and threatened him that if he couldn't do it, he would send the whole village away. The village leader wanted to say something but stopped. Only one sentence from Xion made the old man obey him. He quickly put on his hat and went out. Jin and Xion remained in the house, and Jin couldn't help but complain because the place was really wet and humid. The skin on his fingertips wrinkled up like blisters, looking uncomfortable. While waiting, Xion suddenly thought of learning the secret to growing these mushrooms. So after finishing his meal, the village leader asked if the two of them would enjoy a meal. Xion expressed joy and comfort after eating, complimenting the mushrooms as very delicious, asserting that they must have some secret to make the mushrooms so delicious and big. The village leader also did not hide anything, saying that they were all grown the way their ancestors taught them. There was no big secret. Xion then put on a solemn face and asked the old man to let them open their eyes to see how they would grow these mushrooms. The old man hesitated. Then he said that it was late and the two of them should stay for the night. Tomorrow we can continue. He also promised that the next day they would see how the mushrooms grew. Jin complained angrily that this place was cramped, stuffy and humid. Even so, Xion was also patient and hard-working and accepted to stay until morning to see the secret to the growing mushrooms. Hearing this, the village leader was also happy and excitedly invited the two of them into the room because the room was already prepared. Soon you will know how these mushrooms are made. As he smiled sinisterly. Thinking of the fruitful land, Xion felt extremely regretful to leave it to a village. He didn't want to lose this land, but he also really wanted to know how to grow these mushrooms. Jin suddenly had an idea. If they got the family recipe the next morning, then they could also drive out the villagers and turn the place into a mushroom farm named Xion. Xion liked this proposal, and he praised Jin for it. About a few minutes later, Xion started to feel hot and sweating like he was in a sauna. Downstairs, the old man asked how the boiling water was. A young man was busy heating the oven, saying that the right temperature could help mushrooms grow quicker. The old man suddenly smiled mysteriously and instructed his son to take good care of the guests. In the bedroom, Xion couldn't stand the heat of the room anymore. After taking off his clothes, he was horrified to find out that his skin was being cracked, as it looked like it was also bubbling. As for Jin, he couldn't move. Shion also didn't know what was going on. He felt extremely worried.
Fire! More wood! Let's boil this water right now!
The old man looked at the wood stove and urged the son on. The horrible thing that happened at this time was that Jin suddenly turned into a dry log and his body was covered with mushrooms. Shion looked everywhere in horror and did not know what to do. Only then did he notice something strange going on in the room. He crawled to the floor, peering down at the openings, detecting steam rising up from downstairs. This is why the room was so hot. Shion panicked and ran to the door, screaming in despair, and called for help from the village leader. The village leader's son heard the screams. He only uttered one sentence. "Looks like the people upstairs have found out." It was estimated that the mushrooms on their bodies were growing madly, and the next morning they would definitely sprout, and that was their plan. Finally, the job was completed, and the village elder was overjoyed. And yes, the fungus on Shion's body grew at a very fast rate, bringing terrible pain to him. Anyone could guess what the outcome would be.
So there will be more mushrooms to harvest.
One day, our family was watching the news on TV, and in recent years, the environmental pollution index in the city was skyrocketing remarkably. Therefore, relevant experts called for increased protection of the environment from heavy pollution and the need to rectify polluting enterprises. If the immediate action was not taken, an ecological disaster of a large scale could break out at any time. As my family was watching TV, I noticed something strange outside as I looked out of the window curiously. All my doubts disappeared when I saw snow. It was special because for the first time I saw snow falling in front of me with my own eyes, seeing that the place where I lived never had snow before. I immediately told my mother, but she didn't believe me and thought I was talking nonsense, because how could it snow in the summer? She couldn't believe it, so she went outside to see it for herself, and she was also surprised because this snow for this season was indeed real. After that, my family would put on warm clothes because it was very cold. When we got out to play in the snow, I really enjoyed it. I said, "Wow, what a big snowstorm!" The unseasonal snowfall made my mother a bit worried. She wondered if this had any effect on the health of the family. And at this point, my father reassured us that there was no problem at all. My dad also said that because I've never been in real snow, this was a rare opportunity to let us have fun. And at that moment, my father caught a big mosquito. It was rare that snowflakes and mosquitoes appeared at the same time. This phenomenon must be said to be unique. While I was playing in the snow with my family, I called my dad to catch a ball. At that moment, my dad ducked for the snowball that was going over him. My mom and I were on the same team and to fight my dad with snowballs. My mother covered the snowball and gave it to me. She threw it at my dad. Suddenly, the ball flew into my father's eyes and he couldn't seem to see anything. After a while, the whole family had fun with snowballs, and we decided to rest on the snow together. My leg was a little bit sore. My mother turned to me and asked if it hurt from running a lot, but actually it was not that I was tired from running, but they were indeed very itchy and painful. My mother helped me to sit up, and for a while she checked to see if my leg was okay. I felt pain as she took off my shoes, and as soon as she saw my legs, she panicked. She told me to endure the pain a little, and at a glance I could see that the soles of my feet were very swollen. The swelling was getting bigger and bigger, and the blood was seeping out of white socks. As soon as I opened the socks, it was a horrible thing. Inside, my feet were countless mosquitoes crawling in parasitically scary ways. My mother suddenly realized this was a horrible thing. She shouted to my father that he should come right away, as this snow was something bad. My father felt the same way and urged my mother to take me inside. At the time, the TV was also broadcasting an emergency announcement. A storm was coming to the city. It contained many mutant insects released from an X-organization research center, to be exact, white spherical objects in the form of snow. And the TV went on to say that when it came into contact with the surface of a human skin, it would absorb heat and expand quickly. Moreover, this type of mosquito was very keen to attack humans. They would eat deep into your flesh and blood. News reports advised people to quickly evacuate all the buildings immediately and close the doors and windows, because the insects would die within 24 hours after they fell to the ground. So everyone took the time to find a place to hide and survive this important 24 hours. When I heard it, my dad was really surprised and didn't believe it was true. He was afraid that something bad would happen to me with all these mosquito bites. My mom told me there was something wrong with the snow because it was full of bugs and mosquitoes, and told my dad to get some mosquito spray right away. My father immediately went to get the spray bottle. When he came back, both my mother and father were extremely alarmed. On my feet had appeared a bunch of holes. My father was scared and worried about me. My mother also panicked but tried to hold back and reassure me. She immediately used bug spray and sprayed it on my feet. She was careful, as she used little by little. I knew something was wrong, as my leg was painful, as if something was eating out my flesh. Luckily, many bugs left my skin as my mom was spraying them. Many bugs and mosquitoes kept falling to the ground. My mother was over the moon and said everything was fine because the bugs were already dead. But I didn't expect my mouth to continue to hurt. Then again, I asked my parents for help because my mouth was in pain, like something was coming out of my skin. When my mother heard that, she became more and more worried about me, and her tears didn't stop falling. Even more surprising was that there was something a little strange about my father. Maybe after the snowball fight we had, it was because of one that touched his eye. Once again, the dismay on my mother's face was evident because she knew the scariest thing was going on. The mosquitoes took refuge in the snowstorm and attacked us. How long did our family last?